Alright, how's it going, everyone? Welcome, Little Gonzalez here. And today, let's take a look now at the React hooks, the Model 3, and understand how do we get here pretty quickly, right? So, because the whole point is to understand now what is the reason of React to exist, and that is by going through describing is the history, which is a tool that it was defined and developed by the R&D at Facebook in 2011 when they have some particular issue to update different UIs with the same data, right? So now they come up with this particularly tool known as React that allow us to sync is one state across different UI. So that was quite simple and revolutionary because not only that we can do that on the web, all right, but also for other platforms that can allow you to render user interface and hold some piece of information in an state. So it means that you can also do that with React Native application, or to target is OS, mobile, uh, so mobile development, right? Like the so mobile development, right? So for different OS, mobile OS platforms, iOS, Android, Windows phones, and also is other place where you can render elements such as the WebLG using not 3GS, which is a wrapper around the WebLG primitive. So far this is the place where we can use now React. There are also other environments we can run that, for example, like virtual reality, which is of course dropped by Meta, formerly Facebook. So Mark Zuckerberg push now to stop the efforts on to pushing the mobile, the to push the AR and VR. So now it is going to focus all of its efforts on the ML and then AI, right? And so with all of this, I went through understand now how can we work with React, what is React and what is allow us to do. So by creating is small snippets of React, all right, which is wrapping around a UI elements, in our case on the web. And then once we receive that, we can now is modify it as attributes of that element, and then generate is a JSON object that describe is the UI state. So that makes a lot of sense because as we create this UI components in this way, so the web development now go from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to now this component-driven development, where all of this now are encapsulated in one file. All right. So this file, known as with extension of the ESX, it contains the HTML and JavaScript as well as the CSS in one file. So because React at the end of the day is just giving a functions that allow you to create this user interface. It's going to hold the state or it's going to produce is the UI state, all right? So it becomes quite tedious to always, anytime that you create this interface, well, you have to invoke those functions. So to avoid that, we have now this particularly markdown or language known as GSX, which is an abstraction of defining is the HTML and the JavaScript as well as the CSS in one place, right? So I also look at what is this GSX, how GSX is different from the HTML and from other template engines like Liquid or Blade from PHP, or Liquid from Ruby and Shopify, and also describe is the anatomy of this component. So how this component actually looks like, and what is now. So you have now the components and which are functions at the end of the day that describe is this UI, and how you can organize your applications using now React. When you have the entry point where you're gonna mount the application and define all of the CSS files, and the app home for React setup components, so like context, or when you want to now wrap is your components with that holds specific data, for example router view, and so router data or data fetchings or catchings or even for themes, you name it. But the thing here is, once I look at that, all right, and this basic anatomy of a project, you have the entry point with index.html and the app, which is the app home, the app.gsx or tsx if you're using TypeScript, and also your ES model that describe is this component, this UI component. Well, then I look at how can we now is use some of the built-in React components, for example like fragment, what fragments allow. How can we render a list of elements using now the built-in array methods? I do think that's quite compelling, right? So you don't have to set your own language template logic like other language and other templating engines have to do. So Blade, or how was it called? So Blade, or what's the other one? Jesus. Blade, or well, you name it. All right. Anyway, Liquid. Okay. And after that, now also how can I is conditionally rendering elements, right? So using whether it's if statements for early returns. Usually when you want to handle is the authentication there, you want to redirect a user from one place to another place, right? Or when you want to use now I or and statements to show conditionally is certain features based on some user roles, most likely. And also is a ternary condition, which act like an if-else statement on the template. Next is understand how you can now add CSS to your React components via the CSS model, all right? And then small applications to starting to develop our intuitions around that. And on the second model, which is working with state, so understanding is how we respond to user events without React, which is the browser at the end of the day expose all of these different events. So you can think of this like a mini private investigator that track every little thing that you do. So the way how you respond to this event is either by selecting that element and attach an event listener, all right, via document.get element by ID or query selectors using the CSS selectors, or by explicitly pass now a function execution on the event attributes at that HTML tag, right? Because now in React it doesn't work this way. You are going to pass a function reference that is when the users trigger that, React will detect that and auto call that function for you. This is what, for example, the dependency injection is called. I want to make a quick recap here. Yeah, I definitely want to hit the brake a little bit. Yep, absolutely. Because I do think that's a very important topic here, right? Um, in terms of understanding what this tool is doing for us. So let's get into this. And that is where it was. Oh, I get it. This is on JavaScript. They have, hey, you don't know JS, you don't know series. When we talk about models, all right, especially on the scope and closures, as you can see here, right? Let me see if here, I don't think it's this, I think it's in chapter 7. When we call here the closures, this is an alternative perspective, but I do think, okay, it is on the appendix. Let me see here. So dependency, no, it's not here. No problem. Let me read about this. Dependency injection. All right. So why am I mentioning this? Okay. Well, because this is what we are. This is what how we respond to events in React is not by this traditional way of or passing a function call into that specific event on the HTML tag, or by attaching an event listener to that element. Is now we are passing as a function reference to this React components, aka to this UI wrapper, or this wrapper around the HTML tag or collections of HTML tag. So now because of this, I do think this is one important thing to at least mention, right? So notably, Martin Fowler, which is one of the member of the Agile Manifesto, and he also worked for ThoughtWorks, a Chicago-based IT consulting company who hosts the Tech Radar, which is released bi-yearly. I do think that's quite interesting. So it actually shows the current state at the moment of the language, techniques, platforms, and tools of software. That's actually pretty interesting. So yeah, this is Martin Fowler, also the author of several books. Notably, Martin Fowler cites IOC, this inversion of control, which is exactly what we're doing here. We are passing, when we pass this functions reference to be handled by React, and when the user responds to that, we are delegating that to React. So it's React role to call that function for us. So as the difference between a framework and a library. With a library, you call your functions. With a framework, it calls your functions. From here, inversion control. That was in 2005. This sir is well ahead of time, not ahead of time. It's just deeply into this industry. So inversion control is a common phenomenon that you come across when extending frameworks. Indeed, it is often seen as defining characteristic of a framework. And let's consider a simple example. Imagine I'm writing a program to get some information from a user and I'm using a command line inquire. It might do it something like this. Ruby puts what is your name, say name gets, okay, and process name to get that, and puts what is your quest and assign that value to whatever gets. So I'm assuming this is some internal value to actually get the value from console, right? And then process quest. In this interaction, my code is in control. I decide when to ask the question and when to read response and when to process those results. However, if I were to use a windowing system to do something like this, I will do it by configuring a window. So you can see you got all of this. Hey, I need to import this, right? I need to create a new instance of that window. I'm going to create now a label here. Here, I'm going to now add a property called pack. All right. And then I'm going to hold that value from that pack newly created and bind that off. So you have to go through all of this. And there is a big difference now in the flow of control of this program. In particular, the control of when the process name and process quest methods are called. Process name and process quest methods are called. So this is why I mentioned, and I hit the brake here, of this inversion of control. Wait, what? So yeah. There you got it. All right. So that's why I mentioned here, right? On the model 2 of the states, working with states. So after we understand that, right, and how can we now pass or attach a handler to these user events that are exposed to us by the HTML spec, and it is called for us via React. Now when we want to add some interactivity, we use now particularly function provided by React, which is called as hook, right? All right, I'll be right back. All right, and because I have to show this the inversion of control, which is exactly what we're doing here when we're passing a reference to React. So it now responsible for calling our function when the user is detected by the browser, right? So, and then I also look at how can we now add interactivity to our applications, and this is small user interface, right? Especially when you want to, for example, now add a counter, or yeah, most likely for add a counter, which is a basic simple one, right? So to do so, we have is these particular functions that React provide to us that allows to hold now is primitive data, right? And also objects to hold the state of that data, and any time that we need to update that data, we call this inside of this inside of those handler functions, we update the state, and then internally React now pass through this core loop event, or the core loop, which is what happened when we update the state on an application uh, based on user inputs. So this core loop is made of the trigger, the render, and the commit, which is initially detected. So you have two phases. So the first is what happened when you mount the application for the first time is now starting to recreate the entire DOM elements by calling directly is the append child and create the user interface in a tree-like structure. And the other is once that is done and the user now triggers some sort of event, let's say it click on a particular input to update our counter. So now React is going to detect which component caused that, and then it's going to now call that function or aka that component, and if that component contains more React component, it will continue to calling until there is no more, right? And in this phase known as the render is when the new UI state or this virtual DOM is created and compare with the previous version, right? Through the diffing algorithm. So once you have those different, it's not going to apply the bare minimum necessary DOM updates to the DOM, known as the commit phase. The browser detects those DOM changes and then repaint that specific UI element. This particular process, it is important for me and for you and whoever is actually looking at this to describe in an interview, because if you don't know that, you are not going to move forward this company or any other company and so on and so forth. We need you to understand, be able to describe that and do that in the most precise way possible. Okay? So this is true. So after that, all right, I look at, well, how can we now is working with inputs, particularly with form inputs. What is the subtle difference between, before going to that, is between the render and the painting. Rendering in computer graphic is, it refers to taking our raw processed data and returns an output out of that, right? So for example, this is something that you look in graphic applications like Blender, when you generate this raw model, all right? Let's say is some sort of person or a tree or some model, okay? A person or a tree or any other model, and then you want to now is generate that output in a two-dimensional way. Okay, so whether it's an image or a video, so on and so forth. But in the case of React, render mean is the process of computing and calculating is the difference with the previous snapshot. Okay, that's what a renders mean here. So I also look at how you can work with inputs, especially with foreign inputs. Why it's useful for us to understand this? Because most of the time on the web app, we develop is a list of elements or forms, right? These are the two main things that we're going to do in our in the entire industry, right? So how you can show a collection of values meaningful to the users is a list usually, and how you can collect data from it. So with forms, where traditionally when you use that without React, well, it actually trigger a call to a server, forcing a hard refresh. But because in our case we don't want to do that, we now is attach that function reference to the onSubmit. Okay, so when it comes to detect what the change, when it comes to detect data change on inputs, because now in HTML, input text, cell, or others passwords uh, are different from radio button or checkboxes or select. So React say no. Let's go to now define is a particular interface where we can have a common place to interact and retrieve this data. This is known as the two binding data, the two or the input data binding. So when React now take control of that, this is known as control input, right? So in contrast, if you want, for example, is to use or avoid to use React to control those input, you can rely on some of the built-in browsers features like form data. Okay. All right. So I also look at how can I use now this input with the text inputs, and also how you can work with values like checkboxes. And so the common interface is you have an input, whether it's an input or a select. And if you want to detect a change, you do that using the onChange. And the pass the event handlers to that to update the state. And in the case of checkboxes on radar buttons, well, you now is use the check value to determine if this is true or not, and attach now a label. All right. And then now make that label attached to the specific input via the HTML form and the ID, right? So far so good, no big deal in that. Also, I look at how useful it is for us to put now key, assign dynamic values to key using crypto, because this is this guarantee is unique values, unlike my.random, right? The technical aspect is that it follows some mathematical principles to actually guarantee a unique value. It a very astronomical low chances to have the same number pulling out of that pool. So here we are. Here we are. Okay. Now, also, when it comes to work with complex data in our state, it is important for us to make that at one level, or whether it's an object or a function, right? And if you find yourself in the need to only load an initial value to an state, you pass now a function, right? So this actually prevents you to anytime that these components are loaded or mounted or are called, well, you need to recompute that value at the end of the day. Remember, at the end of the day, these particular hooks are actually now, when you're passing now a function reference, they are going to call your functions, right? Known as the inversion of control. Okay. So, because I know that's a lot. I know that that's a lot, right? All right. All right. All right. After I look at that, right, and how is useful for us to not pass to always when it comes to working with, when it comes to update the state for complex objects, how we need to generate a new state out of that. It turns out that let's go a little bit too much technical. But if you want to detect if you want to detect that the content of two objects are different, the question is that how do you do that, right? Because this equality in terms of the values, specifically the objects, it is based on its reference, not in its content. So to figuring out the difference, or to spot the difference, you need to actually is verify is the name or the key and the value, and mapping each one of them and figuring out which one of them are different. Not to mention that you also need to verify if the order. But if the order doesn't matter, you need to look at that, right? So there is now a lookup process to figuring out if two objects actually now are the same. So to save yourself, or to save React from that, we also need to return is always a new state of this UI, right? This is when now the functional programming, which is again another paradigm, and this is something that a lot of front-end developers that are out there, you see in Twitter or on Twitter, a lot of them are complaining about it and they don't understand it. They just want to rage click and rage keyword, right? Rage clicking. So the idea is JavaScript is a multi-paradigm language, aka depend of the scenario. If computation is required for a program, so functional programming, it makes a lot of sense. But if coordination and cooperation is important in a program, so object-oriented programming makes a lot of sense. All right. Procedural is something that is again, it exists for historical purpose. Most of us actually don't go with that. You might see that in some junior code or code that actually is the relevance is small, right? The impact is small, so doesn't do that, doesn't hurt on the maintainability. But yeah, so yeah, this is the reason why when working with complex objects or complex states, we always return is a new value out of this. And also understand the reason why we set a unique values in a collection of values, because if we don't use the index, because if for some reason that array index now if we delete some, if we reshape the array size, we will end up with a different index length, right? Or with the same index when we remove an element and we add a new one, remove an element and we add a new one, right? So you might end up in a wonky state situation. So the TLDR is that you don't want to be there. Now, okay. so because of that, right? So because of that, well, it turns out that as we explore, also is, yeah, let me actually explore other topics, because I do think that's very relevant, especially here on handling state, right? Dynamic key generations, and also is the state lifting state up. This is when you want to decide how, when this state is gonna lift. It has now some implications, and this is heavily used, for example, when you define some search inputs, and down below you want to render is a collection of elements and so on and so forth. So this is why we create is this particular project that I do find very, very, very interesting in terms of creating is the layout, right? Using a two-dimensional array, and understand that because that is a fixed collection, right? Is not dynamic. In this particular word game, is the TLDR is you have now 6 attempts to figuring out a 5-letter word, okay? And that was something lead back into 2021, and but now not any longer. But it turns out that this is still relevant to understand that how you can create at least this finite layout, and understand now what React allows us to do, how you can do to do so, and also put a test the JavaScript logic and the intrinsics of how you deal with React scenarios of rendering certain elements and so on and so forth. So you get the idea here. And now finally, finally here, right? On React hooks. So this React hooks, let me see what is in modern React, components are only half of the equation. We also need to learn how to use hooks, and hooks like hooked into React internals for things like managing side effects, capturing element reference, and optimizing performance. So I am quite familiar is for things like managing side effects, okay, or put a reusable logic in that application that you're going to use across your app, okay. Capturing elements reference using useRef, for example, all right, and optimizing performance. I'm not well aware of how you can do that, right? But let's get into this. Let's get into this. All right. So another tool in the toolbox. React hooks. Model 2. Oh, I didn't take notes about it. No, that's fine. Model 3. So I have to do take or write down. So write down data. So write down model 2 recap. Okay. So you got now model 3. Model 3, right? Which is React hook. Right. So it's React hooks, which is another tool in the toolbox. Let me put it here, right? So another tool in the toolbox. That's right. There you got it. Model 3 React hooks. What the hell? Oh, don't tell me that. I do think that's my approval. Yeah, I do think it's my approval. Mm-mm-mm. What the fuck is this? Oh, that's a lot. Shit. Do you have a ticket for this beer? Oh my god, that's not wise. $109 commits. That is mind bending. That is insane, bro. That is insane, bro. That is insane, bro. Anyway. No, take your time. Take your time. Take your time. Yeah. I'm new to this. It's like chill, chill. French toast chill, bro. French toast chill. French toast chill. Data intelligence and monetization. Okay. Oh my god, that's a lot. Yep, yeah. So, oh, install and configure Redux persist. Get data for filters from Redux store. Implement save and reset filters. Mm-hmm. The base64 image for metric select. I don't know where I'm going. I know where I'm going. I know where I'm going. And that is to own the thing. And the only thing that I own is my knowledge about stuff, the ability to articulate and do something about it. All right.
So when I started using React back in 2015, things looked pretty different than they do today. And our way of creating components was using this create class method. Essentially, we would call this function, we'd give it this big object that described our component. We would have like specific React stuff, like we would give it a state property, and this would be the state for our application. And we were able to access specific methods and properties using the this keyword. And this was the case for a couple of years, a few years, until eventually the team came out with class components. And you've probably seen these if you've read some tutorials online. They're still used today, although it's pretty clear that they're on their way towards being obsolete. Structurally, they're very, very similar, right? Like we can kind of just tell broadly from looking at the two that they have a lot in common. There were some little gotchas with this, like actually there's a bug in this code that you had to sort of structure this as arrow functions, otherwise this would be set to the wrong thing because my goodness, I am so happy we don't have to work with the this keyword anymore in React. But structurally it was very, very similar. It was mostly the same thing. And for most of React's life, like it's a relatively new development in 2019 that hooks became a thing. For most of React's life, this was the tool that we had. This was the one tool in the toolbox we had, components. And components are fantastic, right? Obviously, I'm a fan of components. There's something really nice about being able to bundle like the markup that we need, the styles for that markup, and the logic that controls it into like one handy package, and we can reuse that package all over our application. Wonderful thing. But sometimes we have this chunk of business logic that needs to be integrated with React, and it feels pretty darn clunky to have to use a component for that. And one of the examples of that is this idea of render props and using animation libraries that worked in this way. So this is a library called React Motion. And essentially, we would create this motion element, and we would say, all right, I want the opacity to start at 0, but I want it to animate to 1. And we would use this spring helper so that it had this nice animation curve. And this is interesting, right? We would give it a function instead of having a regular child, and that function would have an opacity property, and we would use that in our markup. I know that I'm not explaining this super well, and I don't have to because this pattern thankfully isn't used super often anymore, but effectively we can think of this as like we gave this component some inputs, and it gave us an output, and because components were the only tool in the toolbox, if we wanted the animation to be synchronized with React state, we had to create a component. We couldn't have like a regular function. And it meant that our React application got flooded with these components that existed for a purpose other than rendering user interface, right? The real thing this is doing is processing data. Like it's handling like a logical thing, not a UI thing. And it wasn't just animations. There were a bunch of things that worked this way. I have screenshots of code from earlier versions of React that kind of show this pattern. This is a bunch of components, and granted, I don't know what each one of them does, but most of the components in this whole chain, they're not rendering UI. They're doing some sort of business logic thing. Like Apollo is for doing network requests. Connect is for fetching data through context that we'll talk about a little bit later. We have all this stuff like error policy, authentication, right? None of this is about creating a user interface. It's about doing the data manipulation needed further down the tree for that user interface. And I have this other example, which unfortunately is a little bit blurry and hard to see, but it has a bunch of these different things. Like these first 3 components up here, they're all about doing a transition, so another animation use case using components. We see we have another example of connect, pulling data through the React tree. We have scroll to top route, so really this component is just about scrolling the user to the top when it renders. We have loadable component, which is a component whose only purpose is to lazily load some other component. Right? Do you see how when your only tool is components, we tend to overuse them, right? It's like we only have a hammer, and so we go around our house like hammering in the screws instead of screwing them in with a screwdriver, because like that's the tool that we have to use it. And so the React team has come up with a second tool, a dedicated way for us to share business logic across our application without having to like stack a million components in our application like this. or without having to come up with these like overly clever practices for funneling data through a component that ultimately doesn't produce any UI of its own. And the tool that they came up with is called hooks. Now we've seen an example of this already in the use state hook, and over this module we're going to learn about a few others that solve discrete problems. But the brilliant thing about hooks, the really cool thing about them, is that they allow us to reuse logic just like our components. So where we have like a button component that we can use wherever we need a button, now we have a event listener hook that manages a specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request, right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied into our React application. And my goodness, is it a wonderful pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a conference talk from 2016 talking about how good render props are. And like, I was doing the best with the tools that we had at the time. But looking back, it feels a little bit
All right, come back.
different than they do today. And our way of creating components was using this create class method. Essentially, we would call this function, we'd give it this big object that described our component. We would have like specific React stuff, like we would give it a state property, and this would be the state for our application. And we were able to access specific methods and properties using the this keyword. And this was the case for a few years, until eventually the team came out with class components. And you've probably seen these if you've read some tutorials online. They're still used today, although it's pretty clear that they're on their way towards being obsolete. Structurally, they're very, very similar, right? Like we can kind of just tell broadly from looking at the two that they have a lot in common. There were some little gotchas with this, like actually there's a bug in this code that you had to sort of structure this as arrow functions, otherwise this would be set to the wrong thing, because my goodness, I am so happy we don't have to work with the this keyword anymore in React. But structurally it was very, very similar. It was mostly the same thing. And for most of React's life, like it's a relatively new development in 2019 that hooks became a thing. For most of React's life, this was the tool that we had. This was the one tool in the toolbox we had, components. And components are fantastic, right? Obviously, I'm a fan of components. There's something really nice about being able to bundle like the markup that we need, the styles for that markup, and the logic that controls it into like one handy package, and we can reuse that package all over our application.
Exactly.
Wonderful thing. But sometimes we have this chunk of business logic that needs to be integrated with React, and it feels pretty darn clunky to have to use a component for that. And one of the examples of that is this idea of render props and using animation libraries that worked in this way. So this is a library called React Motion, and essentially we would create this motion element, and we would say, all right, I want the opacity to start at 0, but I want it to animate to 1, and we would use this spring helper so that it had this nice animation curve. And this is interesting, right? We would give it a function instead of having a regular child, and that function would have an opacity property, and we would use that in our markup. I know that I'm not explaining this super well, and I don't have to because this pattern thankfully isn't used super often anymore, but effectively we can think of this as like we gave this component some inputs, and it gave us an output, and because components were the only tool in the toolbox, if we wanted the animation to be synchronized with React state, we had to create a component. We couldn't have like a regular function. And it meant that our React application got flooded with these components that existed for a purpose other than rendering user interface, right? The real thing this is doing is processing data. Like it's handling like a logical thing, not a UI thing. And it wasn't just animations. There were a bunch of things that worked this way. I have screenshots of code from earlier versions of React that kind of show this pattern. This is a bunch of components, and granted, I don't know what each one of them does, but most of the components in this whole chain, they're not rendering UI. They're doing some sort of business logic thing. Like Apollo is for doing network requests, Connect is for fetching data through context that we'll talk about a little bit later. We have all this stuff like error policy, authentication, right? None of this is about creating a user interface. It's about doing the data manipulation needed further down the tree for that user interface. And I have this other example, which unfortunately is a little bit blurry and hard to see, but it has a bunch of these different things. Like these first 3 components up here, they're all about doing a transition, so another animation use case using components. We see we have another example of Connect, pulling data through the React tree. We have scroll to top route, so really this component is just about scrolling
pulling data.
through the React tree. Use case using components.
down
We see we have another
React
example
tree.
of connect, pulling data through the React tree. We have scroll to top route. So really this component is just about scrolling the user to the top when it renders. We have loadable component, which is a component whose only purpose is to lazily load some other component. Right? Do you see how when your only tool is components, we tend to overuse them, right? It's like we only have a hammer, and so we go around our house like hammering in the screws instead of screwing them in with a screwdriver. Because like that's the tool that we have to use it.
For all
And so the
of
React
these
team has come up
use
with a
cases.
second tool, a dedicated way for us to share business logic across our application without having to like stack a million components in our application like this, or without having to come up with these like overly clever practices for funneling data through a component that ultimately doesn't produce any UI of its own. And the tool that they came up with is called hooks. Now we've seen an example of this already in the use state hook, and over this module we're going to learn about a few others that solve discrete problems. But the brilliant thing about hooks, the really cool thing about them, is that they allow us to reuse logic just like our components. So where we have like a button component that we can use wherever we need a button, now we have a event listener hook that manages a specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request, right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied into our React application. And my goodness, is it a wonderful pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a conference talk from 2016 talking about how good render props are. And like, I was doing the best with the tools that we had at the time. But looking back, it feels a little bit like I was happily riding along my horse, not knowing that cars were around the corner. And that's not just...
That I was happily riding my horse, not knowing that Lamborghinis are around the corner. Okay. Okay. I really love about this, is that estoy feliz, in Spanish that'll be, estoy felizmente yo montando en mi moto, corro en 250 sin notar que ahora hay carros voladores. La verga. So the translation is, well, I am riding my own 250cc motorcycle Corvin 3X across Enduro, not knowing that there is flying cars around the corner. Okay. It's like, what the hell is that? Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Okay. So here is just an introduction to say that, okay, this is an introduction to the components, how things were back in versions 17 and 16 and prior to 18. Okay, when you have to organize this user interface in this particular way in the Opurity programming, okay, it turns out that that's quite messy to do so. And then React team say, no, let's going to leverage is the functional approach. That was mind bending. Let's going to leverage is the functional approach because it gave us now certainty about the new state produced in exactly to give us the new state is going to produce, right? And because we have components and sometimes we use components to hold a specific piece of information or state. So for example, for transitions, when you want to share now that specific transitions down the tree, or you want to pull data and path through the React tree, uh, for example, with context, or you want to have access to some network request features, okay, and or to have access to now persistent storage, right, layers using another component. As you can see now, you're starting to use components for everything. you know, okay, you're starting to use components for everything. So the React team say, hey, you know what? Sometimes when we have this business logic, let's going to put now here to handle that. All right.
Component that we can use wherever we need a button. Now we have a event listener hook that manages a specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request, right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied into our React application. And my goodness, is it a wonderful pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a conference talk from 2016 talking about how good render props are. And like, I was doing the best with the tools that we had at the time. But looking back, it feels a little bit like I was happily riding along my horse, not knowing that cars were around the corner. And that's not to say that hooks are perfect. Everything has trade-offs, right? There are certainly certain problems that were easier with class components than they are with hooks. But by and large, right, overall, I am a much happier and more productive developer with hooks. They have greatly increased my workflow. And I really hope that this module is the one that starts to get you excited, if you're not already, about building with React. Because when you start to get the hang of how hooks and components work together, it is a magical feeling, and it makes React really a ton of fun. So without further ado, let's dive into it.
Yep. Let's get into this. Let's get into this. Mm-hmm.
So one of the cool things about React is that it really prioritizes this idea of reusability, right? That's one of the things you hear, is that React is about reusable components. And I think when we think about reusability, we often think in terms of like buttons or inputs, the low-level Lego bricks that we can imagine peppering throughout our application. I actually think this idea should be used a little bit more broadly, though, and I try to write my components in such a way that any component is reusable, no matter how much it might seem like you wouldn't want to reuse it. The thing that makes this a bit tricky, though, is that there are certain parts of the web platform that strongly disagree with this idea, that don't want everything to be reusable. There are things on the web that are supposed to be globally unique. And I want to look into one of these examples. So I have this website, creatively called Some Website, and it has a login form in the header. If we dig into this code a little bit, we see we have two state variables, username and password, and they're each driving their own input. Now, because I care about accessibility, I've made sure to give both of these inputs a unique ID, login form username and login form password, and I've created labels that are associated with that ID using the HTML4 attribute. This is important for two reasons. The first is that we want to make sure that when I click the label, it focuses the input, right? I don't have to click within the box of the input, I can click the label. This is especially important for like checkboxes and radio buttons, because they're all tiny. But there's another thing that this does, and I think arguably this is more important, which is if I'm visiting the page with a screen reader and I focus an input, by default, all it will tell me is that this is an input with type text, right? This is a text input. What am I supposed to put in that input? Well, that's what labels are for. Because I've set up this label and associated it, the screen reader will announce that this is asking me for my username, which hopefully makes clear that this is a login form. And so this is set up correctly if I only have one of these forms, but this page actually has two of them. I have a second form down here. And notice what happens when I try to focus these inputs by clicking the label. When I click the username down here, my focus is pulled all the way to the top. And this happens because both of these inputs are using the same ID, right? This username input, both of them have the exact same value. And on the web, we are never supposed to repeat IDs. That's the whole purpose of an ID, is that it's globally unique. So how do we solve this problem? Well, one thing we could do, which we're not going to do, but we could, is we could go into our app.js and we could add some sort of unique identifier on both of these two elements of the same component. So I could say the ID of this one is header and the ID of this one is footer. And the idea then is that we would use this ID prop to construct unique IDs for both elements. And the reason we're not going to do it that way is that recently the React team has given us a better option, a dedicated solution to this problem. So inside login form, I'm going to create a new ID variable and set it equal to react.useID. And essentially this does the same thing I had just been talking about doing, of giving a unique ID to each instance of a given component. And I'll show you exactly. If I log this out, if I console.log ID, and then I refresh this page, well, I get some warnings in the console about the very issue that we're trying to fix. So thank you, browser, for letting us know, but we got it. And then above that, I see ID R0 with the colons and ID :R1. And this is a bit weird, right? You might be wondering, why am I seeing it twice? I only added a single console.log, but we are logging for both instances. And so when the header gets rendered, the ID is equal to R0. When the footer gets rendered down here, suddenly the same code, react.useID, produces a different value. It is now R1. And as you might have guessed, right, this is an ever-increasing number that will correspond to the number of instances. So React internally knows how many instances of a given component exist, and it stores that information on the instance. The useID hook lets us hook into that internal data and access that ID. Now that I have this unique number, I can create, let me get rid of this, I can say that the username ID should be equal to that current ID with maybe a suffix like username, and I'll do the exact same thing for password. Now with the magic of editing, I snap my fingers and all of a sudden we've applied that data. So I've taken my username ID and password ID and replaced these static strings that existed there before with these new values. And so now if we look at it in the DOM, I'll inspect this input and I see that it is :R0:username and the password is :R0:password. And for the other one, for the footer, we see that it's the exact same thing, but with R1 instead of R0. So essentially, the useID hook lets us hook into the component instance to access the unique identifier for every component instance. Now there is one more thing I want to cover before we wrap up for this video, and it has to do with whether there are other ways for us to accomplish the same goal. Like, if we think about it, our mission is to make sure that the login form in the header and the login form in the footer have different values that we can use for these IDs. And there's a bunch of ways to come up with unique values. Like I could use math.random. So why not use something like math.random for this unique identifier? Well, let's try it. Let's say that I have a alt ID, and I'm going to set it equal to math.random. And then I'm going to console log both of them. So ID and alt ID. And when the component first mounts, things are actually looking pretty good, where in the header we have either R0 and R1, or 0.16 and 0.00. That is a very low random number. Both of these are different, and so that seems to be working pretty well. But when I start actually typing in this input, right, I'm triggering state changes with every character change because both of these inputs are driven by React state. And look at what happens. My alt ID is generating a new number on every single render, whereas the useID ID is stable across renders. It's always going to be R0 because we're hooking into that instance, and the instance doesn't change between renders. This is something that is unique to React hooks. And it makes sense when we think about it, because whenever we re-render a component, we call the function again. And so math.random is going to get called on every single render, just like any other function that we do that isn't a hook, right? This is a special thing with hooks, that we're able to pass things along between renders like this. So that's the real reason that this hook exists, and hopefully you find it useful.
In practice, toggle component. In this sandbox, you will find a toggle component that has been almost fully implemented. Finish it up by adding a unique ID to the bottom and connecting it to the label. You should be able to trigger the toggle by clicking the dark mode text. So in this case, right? So you want to uniquely implement this. No, this is just a fun mini demo, not a full featured dark mode implementation. Right? So what I did here, I didn't need to use that. Alright? I was in fact, it's just double checking that this actually works as expected. And since here we have now finishing up by adding a unique ID to the bottom. If I want to add a unique ID to the bottom, right? And connecting it to the label. Okay. So here you say, okay, HTML form, and I need to pass some sort of ID that must be the same ID to this element here. So in other words, what we're doing is to storing this piece of information, right? So what I'm doing here is to storing this piece of information. So I'm holding this piece of data. I'm holding this piece of data. So I'm not holding that. React is holding that for me. React is holding this piece of data, and it's gonna make available across instance. So, AKA, I can use a use ID. All right, from React, use ID, right? And since this is gonna be now generate is a unique stable ID across renders, right? Which is, I'm gonna put it here as the so label ID, or just to say is toggle ID, and hold this as an identifier, and I'm going to use now here. Similar to this, right? And then you got it. And if I do here, that's right. Pretty simple, pretty simple. So this toggle ID, so on any render, aka on any render, on any virtual DOM difference, on any different state of the UI, right? They're gonna preserve that data here. So you have now different state of the UI, and now React is gonna preserve across those renders using now this use ID. So you can think of this like it's using some sort of memoization techniques, something like that, So the holding is a huge table of all of his ID, and so instead of recomputing that, they just to hold that using a memoization technique. All right. So if we inspect that on the console here, you get this, right? So you get the idea here. So if we rerun this, right, we get is 01, okay, and no matter how many times we toggle this, we also get always is the same stable one. Makes a lot of sense. So makes a lot of sense. All right, stay with me. I'll be right back. Rules of hooks. So we have talked about how hooks are special functions that allow us to hook into React internals. Use state allows to hook into a component's instance state. For example, while useID allows to create and store a unique identifier on the component's instance, okay, useState allows to hook in to a component's instance state. To hook into, hook into, hook into, hook into. To become connected to something such as computer network or a source of electrical power. Hook into. Do you have any image of hook into? Exactly. Hook into. In Spanish. Exacto, como enganchar. Hooking. Okay. Okay. So user state allows to hook into a component's instance state. Hey, podemos engancharnos en el estado del componente con estos estados, con use state. While useID allows to create and store unique identifiers on component's instance. What happens if we try to call these functions outside of React context? It won't work. It won't work. It won't work, right? Invalid hook call. Hook can only be called inside of the body of a function component. You know, it's because it's a component's instance, it's a function component. This could happen for one of the following reasons. You might have mismatched version of React and the render, such as render root. You might be breaking the rules of hooks. You might have more than one copy of React in the same app. For tips about how to debug this. In addition to an error, we're giving a console message that looks like this. It shows that something goes horribly wrong and provides three possibilities. Error 1 and 3 refers to rare edge cases. Exactly. You might have a mismatched version React and render, such as the React DOM, or you might have more one copy of React in the same app. Right? So it's like you are calling React twice in the same app. Right? But what the second bullet point is interesting. What are the rules of hooks? First, let's understand that hooks are plain old JavaScript functions, that they aren't quite as magical as it might seem. But when we call these functions, they hook into React internals, and we can catch React off guard. It expects these functions to be used in a very specific way, and if we violate those expectations, bad things happen. There are two rules of hooks that we should learn in order to make sure we're always using hooks as React expected. Hooks as always have to be called within the scope of React application, and we can call them outside of the React component. Exactly. And we have to call our hooks at the top level of the component. The second rule is the one that trips most people up. We have to call our hooks at the top level of the component. So let's talk about it.
So let's suppose we're building a form. And to make our life a little bit easier, we've extracted this text input component. The idea is that it's going to give us a text input, but also a label for that text input with everything correctly wired. And I want to set it up so that I can optionally provide an ID. Like for the second one, the input ID is going to be my email and the label is going to be connected to that ID. But if I don't pass an ID, I want React to generate one for me automatically with the useID hook. If we look at how I've implemented this, it seems kind of reasonable. I have this ID prop, which may be a string or may be undefined. I assign it to a variable, If that variable is undefined, it means I haven't provided an ID, and so I'll update this variable to use the useID hook. If they have provided an ID, then this expression evaluates to false, and I stick with the ID that they've provided. And so either way, I'm giving it an ID, whether that's the one they've provided or the generated one. But when I do this, I get a lint warning, and I see a very unhappy red squiggle underneath my hook. And this is like one of the most common stumbling blocks with React. It's the sort of thing that everybody trips over, and then as they're like rubbing their knee, they're scratching their head and trying to figure out why on earth it's implemented this way. Because it really does seem like the most natural thing in the world that, of course, sometimes I'm not going to need an ID and I want to do it conditionally. So why is this a problem? Well, that's a rabbit hole that I really don't want to go too far down right now. But I will give you sort of a high-level understanding of what the problem is. And the problem is that React hooks are implemented in a way where the order matters. The way that React can tell which hook is which is by the order that they're being called whenever the component renders. And so if that order changes, because sometimes I'm calling this hook and sometimes I'm not, React doesn't know how to handle that, and it's going to give us warnings, and if we ignore those warnings, it's going to start throwing exceptions. Bad things happen if we try to work around this. And this isn't the best example. Like in here, it actually does seem like it would be fine, but let's look at another example. Let's say I have these two state hooks. I have x, which is equal to 0, and y, which is equal to 5. The very first time this component renders, when the component mounts, I give React the default values for each of these state variables. The first one gets a value of 0, the second one gets a value of 5. And React takes note of this by their order. So it says first hook is equal to 0, second hook is equal to 5. It has to work this way because it's not like I'm giving React any sort of ID. It's not like I'm saying the first one should have an ID of x and a value of 0, and the second one should have an ID of y. If this was the API, React would be able to have essentially this big object inside where it can tell, like, okay, I have this state variable which is called x, this one which is called y, but that's not the API, right? The API is I don't give React any sort of unique identifier for each of these state variables. And so as a result, it relies on the order. And let's suppose now I have like some condition where I optionally choose to render this hook or not. If we imagine that on the first render this is true, well then React sets it up this way, where the first hook is equal to 0, the second hook is equal to 5. But what happens if that condition flips to false? Well, now we skip over this code, right? This code doesn't exist. And so the first hook that we call, it thinks is going to be the one that we're currently tracking as 0. And so essentially, it's going to give me the value for x when I'm telling it I want y. Now you might be saying, well, wait a minute, I am giving these state variables names. The first one is called x, the second one is called y, the names are right here. But the thing is, React doesn't actually see any of this. The only thing React knows is when we call one of these functions, right? It sees that the useState function has been called, and we've given it some value to be used as the initial value. But on subsequent renders, it has to first figure out, okay, which of these internal state variables do I want to provide? And then it wraps them up in an array with the setter function, and it returns that. And then we, on the consuming side, destructure that array and give it a name, but React has no visibility into the code that we write inside our components like this. I know that this stuff probably seems pretty like abstract and hard to follow because it's true, React is a complicated tool, and we don't really have that deep an understanding of how it works internally. But the bottom line is that we are not allowed to call a hook conditionally, whether that's in an if condition or a ternary expression, or even within a function call or a for loop or anything like that. Essentially, it's a little bit of an oversimplified rule, but if we ever find ourselves trying to use a hook while we are indented, where we're not at the sort of top level of the function, we're going to have a problem. We need to make sure that we're calling the exact same hooks in the exact same order on every single render. And this applies even in cases like this, where like realistically, both, this one has an ID of a string, this one doesn't have an ID. They're not going to change. It's not like this is some state variable that's going to be different values on different renders, but all the same, React doesn't know that, and it's the best practice to always make sure that we are not using hooks conditionally. In terms of how we fix this, like how do we solve this problem? Well, I'm going to get rid of this condition entirely. I'm going to create a new variable called generated ID, which is going to be equal to react.useID. And then the applied ID is either going to be the ID if it's provided, otherwise I'm going to use the generated ID. If I inspect this in the DevTools, I see that my text input for name is given the ID of :R10, that's the generated ID with the useID hook. But I see the other one, the email input, is using the string my email, right? That's the value that I provided within the app component.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's a sandbox of the video here. Because at the end of the day, React is generating is those. So we can hook into React internals by calling is the React state into the components instance, into the component states instance. Okay, so React internally doesn't have any way to know the identifier of this based on the function. So because we so far cannot, so you cannot is this is going deeper into the rabbit hole. This is definitely going deeper into the rabbit hole. So the theory is that since when we call the state, the hooks on React, and here the order matters, and we are not providing any some ID to uniquely identify this hook, all right? Uh, Only a value. So React is rely purely is on the order in which this was defined. Holy moly! So if of course that order change, so the component state might be in a wonky one. Okay, interesting. Mm-hmm. 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 Hmm. That is mind bending, bro. That is mind bending. That is mind bending. Something missing. That is mind bending. You call this, and then you apply this ID. Mm-hmm. And then you have now some exercise. Fix the violation. Mm. 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 It's oh okay. It's because you need the value here. You need to hold the value. Mm-hmm. 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 Exactly. It's because all of those state needs to be put at the top because order matters for React in these components. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. That'll be all for this video. I'll be right back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Como a las 11, ¿no? Sí. pareció ridículo. En vez de estar comprando criptomonedas, prefiero comprar hallaca, compartirla, o un asadito. Bien, listo. Pues, ya. Así conocen gastronomía venezolana. Y yo disfruto de la gastronomía argentina. Bien. No, este bicho es muy grande. A ver. Y listo. Think whatever you want. Think whatever you want. I honestly don't care. I honestly don't care. Bueno, como debe ser. Como debe ser, boludo, como debe ser, ¿eh? Las minas tienen que saber, amigo, you don't get it. You're not ready. You're not ready. You ain't ready. You ain't French toast ready. Because if you don't deploy, guava, guava, Julia. Now I got a sour that banana. Oh, come on, look at me. What's wrong with that? I know you can't. Don't go with that. I know you can. Julia, Julia, Julia. Sassy bitch. Sassy bitch. I prefer to be with this person like fair enough, man. Fair enough. This is what it is. It is what it is, my girl. So make no mistake about it. Oh look. bloqueame estos números privados, ¿no? Qué vaina. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Is this I think is it one of the services? Mm-hmm. System manager. Mm. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. 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 Mm-hmm. 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 It is a service that is not available for new customers. Mm-hmm. Mm. And they all are merry. An enterprise-grade change management solution as a replacement of the AWS System Manager Change Manager. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Look at you. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. haste, haste, rushing, rushing only leads to fatigue. So, haste, haste makes waste. Hates makes waste. Hates, exactly. Hates makes waste. So, um, it's because they have it. Mm. 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 The UI. Octa. Octa parent path. Octa issue. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how you can implement an Octa here. Mm-hmm. Secure identity for employee. It is making quadrant for access management. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Login services. Mm-hmm. Exactly. For access management. Mm-hmm. The compiler, they haven't add that. And on this release, they add this. They add React Router, Redux Persist, Redux Persist. And not NSTAC.
No,
Buena, buena. ¿Cómo va?
¿todo bien? Hagamos así el deploy rapidito, yo te muestro,
Sí,
como ya son las 5 y tintos,
sí.
te muestro así y después el lunes nos juntamos bien temprano. ¿Vos desde qué horas estás?
Desde las 9.
Ah, vale.
Solo que aprovecho por lo menos la horita de la mañana tempranito como para actualizarme con React, con TypeScript, más que todo.
Ah, vale, bien, 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 bien. Bueno, entonces, por lo general, no debería pasar tanto para mandar a producción, pero pues como el ambiente de producción aún no estaba listo porque faltaban unas cosas.
Claro.
Yo no había mandado, por eso son tan grandes los cambios. Entonces, en sí, el flujo se crea el PR, pero se manda de develop a un branch que se llama release candidate. ¿Ve? Acá no existe main ni master. Solo existen dos branches: develop y release candidate. Cuando vos vas a hacer una tarea, salís de develop y le pones el ID de la tarea al nombre del branch. ¿Ok? Después eso se manda a develop, se crea el PR contra develop, se aprueba y cuando lo aprueban se hace merge y automáticamente se hace el deploy a develop. O sea, no tenés que entrar a hacer nada. De pronto a ver si se deployó. ¿Vale? En el caso de test y producción, se manda un pull request desde develop a release candidate, ¿sí? Y en teoría, como ya todo se mandó a develop, todo se controló en develop, todo se testeó, no debería romper, teoría, ¿no? Pero pues la ley de Murphy. Cuando ya se aprueba, se hace el merge, ¿sí? Este es de la API. Se hace el merge y se ingresa a AWS. Que este te lo voy a enviar para que los tengas por ahí. A ver. Sí. Y este primer, ¿cómo se llama? Esta primera cuenta es la que hace, donde puedes monitorear los pipelines. ¿Okay? Entonces vos entras, pues no sé, la sesión. Espérate que justo se me cerró la sesión. La abrí esta mañana, es cierra como cada 8 horas, no me acuerdo. Y acá a mí me va a aparecer aquí porque porque entro ahí, entonces me aparecen recently visited. Pero ya te digo cómo se llama. Vos, ¿dónde aparece buscar? ¿Por qué no aparece buscar? Acá. Entonces vos buscas code pipelines. Y es este, ¿ok? No hay más. O sea, si vos buscas code pipelines, no hay más. Y acá buscas market stats. Yo ayer te expliqué, que dice market stats backend infra, solito, es dev. Ese se deploy automático. ¿Ok? Y este que dice backend, market status, backend infra release, es test y prod. ¿Ok? Para corre ciertos procesos automáticos, pero acá tenés que aprobar el deployment. O sea, acá no se hace automático como en dev, sino que acá tenés que aprobar el deployment. Después de que aprobas el deployment, él empieza o sea, él hace el build primero luego haces el approval y luego él empieza a mandar esos cambios, eso que vendió acá, los manda al ambiente de test. ¿Me a entender?
Esa aprobación
Entonces él ahí empieza a hacer sus cosas de AWS, correr unas cosas que eso no hay que modificarlo, a no ser de que sea justo y necesario, pero no debería haber problemas.
Esa aprobación es por parte de el que está liberando la característica.
Sí, a ver, en este proyecto nosotros somos toderos, somos como la banda de Homero. Tocamos la guitarra, el bajo y la batería y cantamos. ¿Sí? En un mundo ideal debería haber una persona que se encargue de eso. Entonces, esa persona hace el merge y esa persona es la que debería acceder acá, darle la proof y promoverlo a test. ¿Me van a entender? Pero como no lo hay, entonces te toca a vos.
Claro.
¿Sí? Entonces él empieza a hacer todo lo que tiene que hacer, empieza a configurar cositas, ¿sí? No sé si has trabajado con Jenkins o con Travis o con...
Sí, trabajé con
Bueno,
Jenkins y con GitHub Actions.
bueno, haga de cuenta la misma cosa, ¿sí? La única diferencia es que en GitHub Actions creo que no está esa parte donde vos le tenés que dar el approval, sino que automáticamente cuando haces el merge al branch que estás escuchando, pues él empieza a correr sus cosas. Este Code Pylons es eso. ¿No entendés? Cuando eso ya está configurado, ellos, Infra lo configuró, ¿sí? Yo hice solo ciertas cositas, ciertos ajustes, pero cuando uno le da promote, este es el que se corre en el build. ¿Ves? Estos son los comandos que se corren para build. Y npm install, npm run build, npm run test. ¿Sí? Y este es el que promueve, este es el que promueve, el que promociona, el que envía los datos a los ambientes, el que hace el deployment. ¿Me entendés? Este agarra y corre Terraform ya sabe qué hacer, ¿sí? Entonces, Terraform ya tiene cierta configuración, ¿sí? Por decir, llega aquí las APIs. Entonces hace la configuración de cores, ¿ves? Hace la configuración del API Gateway, otro montón de huevonadas. Este data es para... esta es la configuración donde se aloja el archivo del lambda. ¿Sí? Este es el que crea el zip del lambda. ¿Entendés? Y este es la configuración de los lambdas, de los roles, de los ambientes, de las variables de entorno. O sea, esto no hay que modificarlo a no ser que sea necesario. Entonces, este script es el que promueve que corre Terraform y Terraform sabe qué hacer.
Bien.
¿Bien? Igual no te preocupes porque yo de Terraform no sabía nada, solo sabía el nombre. Entonces yo empecé a preguntar, por eso te digo, cuando yo entré, yo me tardé más o menos un mes haciendo el onboarding, pero porque tuve que descubrir un montón de cosas para hacer el deployment a dev, también me tardé como un mes. Porque tuve que preguntar, un montón de pedir access, no hice. Esto ya está. ¿Sí? Entonces él empieza a hacer sus cosas, ¿sí? El Terraform empieza a hacer sus cosas, crea los lambdas si no están creados, los actualiza, sube los archivos, hace la configuración. En este caso, en test no estaba creado el servidor de Redis, es para caché. Esto se crea con Terraform, que eso lo hicieron los de infra. ¿Sí? Y él empieza a correr todos esos scripts, y aquí falló. Y acá es donde necesitamos a Andrei. Bueno, porque es medio que ya deployado. Roller is required. Redis. Model lambda mst GraphQL.
Model lambda. Model lambda. Model lambda.
Local lambda ARM. Esto yo creo que va a ser. Bien. Esto yo creo que va a ser porque ellos tienen ya unos paquetes creados para ciertas cosas. Y aquí es donde viene lo bonito. Ahora vamos a mandar porque a veces nos vamos a mandar porque a veces falla la primera vez y toca volverlo a correr. La otra vez me pasó y no me acuerdo cómo lo arreglé. Please can't do it. Vamos a ver qué sucedió. Si no, es un tema. Por eso el deployment tarda tanto, porque, no sé, en GitHub Actions él levanta una imagen de Docker y no tarda tanto. Acá yo no sé por qué tarda tanto.
Ese servicio de SSM no está ya disponible para nuevos usuarios. Lo que estaba leyendo en la documentación de AWS. Entonces no sé si eso tenga algo que ver con eso.
El tema es que en Dev no está fallando, porque yo deployé, a ver, mandemos deploy a Dev. Si en Dev está fallando, si en Dev falla también, hay que verlo, pero ya lo vemos el lunes. Ya fue. ¿Cuándo fue el último deploy? Eso fue el 1 de diciembre. Pero no, pero el rol no creo que se haya deployado. Lo he deployado con ese error. Ahora miramos. Ahí ya vi el día. Voy a pulsar actualizar. Empezar. El día.
Setting base permissions. AWS 3, C3. Again. Y container container.
Eso. Acá crear las lambda. acá agarra las lambda, los sources. Acá selecciona T1 si ese es.
Ahí está creando con Terraform, ¿qué era?
Aquí en este caso está creando con Terraform la instancia de Redis. Redis caché. Acá esto es para crear el admin,
Exacto, la caché de Redis,
el usuario,
Elastic Edge.
crear las policies de grupos, las new parameters. Pero es que esto no está fallando. ¿Qué está fallando?
Es el lambda.
Esto crea los parámetros que se van a usar. Esta, los roles.
Los roles, ahí está. Module lambda emergency role policy attached will be destroyed because index 0 is out of range for count.
Ah, pero cuando llama esto,
Recurso de lambda no está disponible. Ajá.
y falla en dev,
Hay un problema. Que son los recursos que está trayendo de infra, tanto para el rol como el entorno de la variable. Ajá. ID policy role, policy event.
pero acá parece que le estamos dando.
Entonces dice plan 50.
Es que esto lo crea cuando se hace el build de Terraform.
The argument role is required, but it was not found.
Pero lo hacen en la playa, a ver. No alcanza ni siquiera a ejecutar el apply, o sí. Hace Terraform. No, es recién en el plan. Era el rol. A ver.
Sí, dice que en el plan 15 no encuentra la propiedad rol.
Claro. Ven y corremos eso local. Ay, yo no te acuerdo. ver si yo tengo permisos para eso, para producción. Y, ay, a ver. Ay, pero Dios. Vamos a ver. Todo esto tengo que pasártelo, ¿no? Porque pero con está fallando es en el plan.
Ujú. Correcto, en el plan 15.
Que me va a fallar una cosa.
Mm, mm.
Que me va a fallar una cosa. Eh, ¿Vos vas a ir a la fiesta de la empresa para el 18?
Bueno, había visto que... Bueno, me recibí el email, pero no vi a la hora.
Ah, creo que es a las 7.
Ah, no, sí, sí, de 7 a 12, dicen.
Así es que no lo hacen así en 3 semanas. Igual lo hacen para que la gente, por 2 razones. Uno, porque le sale más barato.
Claro. Pero en gran parte eso.
Y para que la gente no se emborrache.
No, por supuesto. ¿Tú vas a ir?
Sí,
Ah, bueno, nos vemos allá.
allá nos vemos. Super Bill Flash. Flash.
Ahorita estás borrando todas las configuraciones de Terraform.
Voy a correrlo a mano.
Mm.
O sea, lo que está corriendo acá, esto es lo que ejecuta. Pero el pipeline, este pipeline, después de que va y manda todo, no a este build, sino a dist. A ver. Bueno, ahora miramos, porque ya no me acuerdo, eso sí no lo tengo anotado. Seguridad data. Dist, así, dist, sí, sí. Eso va y lo manda, lo recibe de acá y lo manda acá. Y lo crea este archivo. En el cel ahí está. Ahora sí, después de eso, seteo el ambiente. Yo todo esto lo tengo anotado. Me falta anotar una cosa. Los ambientes son estos. Esta es la configuración para dev. D1 es dev. T1 es test. Y P1 es
Production.
product. Entonces aquí sería T1. Ah, no, acá no. Sí es T1, pero ahí en esa carpeta no. Esto setea el ambiente que va a usar, o sea, las variables de entorno que va a usar. Son iguales, no cambia nada. Y después de eso, ahí sí llego y le digo, igual creo que eso está duplicado. Ahí sí le digo Terraform Plan T1. Creo que esto está duplicado. Si tengo permisos, me deja. Si no,
¿Quién está manejando las credenciales de Terraform? AWS.
sí.
Listo. Ah, mira, ahora falló en el plan 2.
Sí, pero este es por mi usuario. Este es
Exacto,
por el rol que
por
yo
el
tengo.
rol.
Espérate, igual No, en dev. Ah, en dev también falló.
Sube un cachito, dice plan cero ahí.
Claro, porque dice plan 0 to add, 0 to add,
Ujú.
0 to change, y 3 to destroy.
Eh,
Pero está fallando en lo mismo. Role is required but not defined was found.
exacto. Se
O
necesita.
sea que no es un problema mío, porque cambiaron alguna huevonada del primero acá.
Mm, a nivel de Terraform.
We got an error. No. We were deployed. Ah, puta madre. Pero ¿por qué estoy escribiendo tan malo hoy? La puta madre, ya se nota que es viernes. Sí, es el mismo error, fíjate. Acá es porque hay 15 cosas que no se han enviado ahí. Y acá estas ya se aplicaron.
Claro, pero el error es en AW Lambda Function Executor. Igual.
Claro, exacto. Claro, eso es. Fíjate que acá dice punto Terraform, ¿ves? Este es el que crea para, o sea, ellos, este lambda common es de ellos.
Mm.
Ah, no, es un error de ellos. Fíjate en el, menos mal, uy, estaba yo cagado el susto.
Mhm.
Eso es lo que me gusta de Daniel, ¿no? Viste que ya siempre es como, ¿qué puedo hacer? ¿Cómo los puedo ayudar? Me cae muy bien.
Ah, ok, ok.
No, ya veámoslo el lunes, weón, ya descansemos. Estoy quemadísimo esta semana, voy súper pesado.
Me imagino que, que si yo no tenía los accesos, que tenía que
No,
apagar el
weón,
fuego.
Chala me quemó, weón, porque le escribía a Agus, el lunes era festivo acá,
Ujú.
le escribió a Agus, como Agus no le contestó, entonces le escribió a uno que está arriba de Agus. No, eso se formó un mierdero, weón. Entonces me escribió a mí, le escribí a Agus, me escribí a mí, y yo, Yo, pues, puta. A mí me alivian un poquito la carga porque supuestamente yo iba hasta el 14, entonces yo estaba estresado por eso, weón, porque o sea, yo sé que vos podés, ¿sí? Pero yo no quería como tirarte al agua, así a ver cómo te resolvías,
Claro.
¿sí? Em, Porque no me gusta, no está bien hecho, no me gusta que me lo hagan y no me gusta hacerlo. Entonces, a mí me alivia, ¿no? Cuando el PM de JP Morgan dijo, no, entras hasta enero, entonces puedes quedarte este resto de mes ahí en Bryce. Yo, bueno, no, pues bien.
Mejor, gracias.
Y ahí me quito el estrés, ¿no? Pero yo no estaba durmiendo bien, güey, estaba durmiendo. De por sí yo duermo poco, duermo 4, 5 horas, estaba durmiendo solo 2 horas. Y aparte el lunes
Mierda.
me fui gracioso a montar bicicleta hasta Capilla del Señor, 80 kilómetros hice en un día y llegué vuelto nada.
¿Dónde queda la capilla del Señor?
Mm, Eso queda en zona norte.
Ujú.
¿Has escuchado Pilar?
Sí.
Bueno,
Sí.
30 kilómetros de Pilar hasta
Sí,
allá.
la mierda. Claro, porque en tren son 1 hora 40 minutos. En
Claro, pero
tren.
lo que nosotros hicimos fue que nos fuimos de acá. Yo vivo ¿Vos conocés Unicenter?
Sí, el de Belgrano, ¿no?
No, el de yendo como para Tigre por la Panamericana.
Sí, eso es de no, no es San Isidro,
Sí,
es...
eso es Martínez. Más arriba queda San
exacto.
Isidro.
Mierda. Sí, 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 sí me
Bueno,
ubico, sí me ubico.
yo vivo por ahí. Yo vivo al frente de Unicenter. Unos departamentos que tienen unos avisos de Coca-Cola. Cuando pases que vayas para Tigre, que vengas de Tigre o de esa zona, lo vas a ver.
Claro. Esa zona es linda, hermosa, tranquila.
Sí, está buena. Y entonces de acá nos fuimos hasta Hurlingham en bicicleta, son 15 kilómetros.
Claro. ¿Eso no sería
Y
Vicente López, esa zona?
no, Vicente López es el que sigue más para abajo, más para hacia Capital.
Claro,
O sea, queda cerca. Vicente López queda como de por sí yo estoy cerca de Capital como a 5 minutos en auto o en moto.
claro.
Em,
Claro, porque
Vivo,
agarrás justamente la que se convierte en la avenida... ¿cuál es esa? Avenida Cabildo. La que cuando pasas
la
la
General Paz.
General Paz, esa se convierte justamente en Cabildo. Entonces, claro, esa Cabildo es la que pasa también por Vicente López y sube y se pierde.
Exactamente, exactamente. Entonces, o sea, está Vicente López, después de Vicente López, por el lado de allá queda Olivos, por donde queda
Ujú.
la Quinta de Olivos, después de Vicente López queda San Martín, luego Martínez, luego San Isidro,
Correcto.
y ya de ahí vaya no me sé más. Ya sé que si uno sigue derecho sigue a San Fernando, Tigre.
Exacto, Tigre, San Fernando y si seguí, Santa Fe.
Es
Zárate, porque antes de eso está Zárate.
Zárate.
Y
Pero yo quiero ir a
después...
Zárate, Zárate es lindo. Quiero volver. Yo fui hace muchos años, hace como 12 años. Más,
Mire usted,
en el 2012.
con un evento.
No, fui a llevar unas cosas que me pidieron. Yo tenía un amigo que tenía una empresa de publicidad, esos que hacen avisos
Claro.
publicitarios. Y me dijo, ¿quieres ir a llevar esto allá? Yo te pago todo y te doy la comida. Y yo, hágale.
De una.
Sí, pues no tengo nada que hacer en esos días, no tenía nada que hacer. Yo, pues sí, conozco. Y es lindo,
Sí.
Zárate es lindo.
Y es la zona, como es el parque automotor de, de Cava, de Buenos Aires, prácticamente. Que
Sí,
ahí es donde se fabrican coches de Renault. Hay varias fábricas. Hay varias fábricas.
sí, por ahí cerca, sí, en Zárate hay una, en Campana creo, no sé si todavía siga estando, creo
Cierto,
que quedaba
Campana.
la de la Ford, creada en Campana, la de Ford creada en Campana. Y en Zárate hay otras. No, pero es lindo. O sea, a mí me gustó Zárate. Es lindo. Bueno, y entonces de acá nos fuimos hasta Hurlingham en bicicleta y de Hurlingham tomamos el tren hasta Pilar y en Pilar ya agarramos derecho 30 y tantos kilómetros, 32 kilómetros hasta, hasta Capilla del
Hasta
Señor.
Capilla del Señor. Eso sí,
Y de
todo cubierto de protector solar, porque este sol, amigo, calcina.
no, claro, yo que me quemo con nada. No, yo me cubrí de protector solar la cara, todo. No, donde me hubiera ido sin protector solar hubiera llegado como no sé cómo ustedes le dicen a los pavos.
Un camarón. O los pavos también.
Bueno, nosotros le decimos bimbos a los pavos en Colombia. Acá le dicen pavo. De lo rojo, de lo quemado, pues, estaba
Claro,
fuerte el sol.
claro.
Estaba picante, no estaba fuerte, sino picante. Ese sol que te pica, que te pica, no.
Claro, ¿y si salen a qué hora? ¿Como al mediodía? Porque me imagino que al mediodía, 1, 2, 3 de la tarde, que estaba en la ruta y dándole.
Claro, sí,
Esa
porque
hora
salimos de
pico.
acá tarde, salimos a las 10:30, salimos de la casa.
Como si le,
Íbamos a salir más temprano y no, quedamos haciendo tres.
como si le estuvieran colocando una lupa a las hormiguitas y así.
Sí, sí, bueno, pero a mí me gusta montar en bicicleta, me gusta mucho. Pero pues ya me excedí. Entonces el martes estaba cansadísimo, ya me dolían las pantorrillas, no me dolía la pierna, sino las pantorrillas.
Claro.
Obviamente. Y sí, no, pero bueno, no, eso ya estoy más tranqui esta semana. Y ahora pues estoy tranqui porque ya no es error de nosotros. Justo se juntó con lo de nosotros. Pero bueno, ya ahí lo vemos el lunes.
Sí.
¿Ya tenés acceso a AWS?
No.
¿No te han dado acceso?
No.
Creo que te tiene que llegar un invite al correo de Globan.
No me ha llegado.
Bueno, el lunes le escribís a primera hora a Chala para que él mueva, porque sin eso podemos levantar el front apuntando a la API de dev,
Ok.
pero no podemos levantar el back, porque el back utiliza la base de datos de Redshift y Redshift, para acceder a Redshift
AWS.
necesita AWS.
Ah, listo. Listo.
Listo.
Sí,
Entonces, bueno, miramos.
ahorita estoy viendo y no llega, no he recibido nada. Es más, puedo recibir los mensajes externos de GitHub, ¿no? Del chorizo gigantesco de PR, amigo. Y
No,
cuando yo vi eso, yo dije, no, qué mierda. Bueno, yo confío en Eric.
te tiene que llegar un mail de AWS que se llama Invitation to Join AWS IAM Identified Carrier.
No me llega. Bueno, el lunes. El lunes lo podemos
El
ver.
lunes lo vemos.
Claro, sí, también así no te quito más tiempo y que puedas descansar, porque me imagino que ha sido una semana bien intensa, boludo. La
Sí,
verga.
ha sido pesada esta semana. Pesada, pesada. No, y después esta otra chica tenía estresada, pues, weón. Y algo me dice que respóndele vos. Y yo, pues, que está preguntando estupideces, bueno, ya le escribió ahí, le escribí, o sea, está preguntando lo mismo,
Sí.
todo bien, que lea. Eh, pero estaba estresada y estresa.
Bueno, pero ya es viernes, así que a relajarse,
Sí,
a despejarse.
sí, no, ya más tranqui. Bueno, ahí nos vemos el lunes te escribo temprano para eso de las 10,
Listo.
más o menos.
Bien, bien.
Dale. Eso.
Joya.
Y nos juntamos.
Bien, bien. No, más bien gracias por la clase magistral a Eric, porque pues, ha sido como un ladrillo. Un ladrillo
No,
mental así de conocimiento todo empaquetado así a la mente.
Es que es mucha información, weón. No te digo que yo me mamé un mes y aparte le preguntaba a alguien y no sabía. Y yo entonces yo al último le dije a Chala, yo no, Chala, pues es que déjame, yo me leo los repositorios. Vos vas a leer los repositorios y yo sí, porque ¿qué más hago?
Claro.
Nadie me dice nada, nadie me da razón.
Mm,
Eh, y empecé a buscar cosas de React, proyectos. O sea, no era que me leía repositorio por repositorio, sino que buscaba las tecnologías que quería implementar para el proyecto.
claro.
Y en Confluence, después ya cuando necesitaba lo de Terraform, me mandaron una documentación que eso lo voy a consolidar todo en un archivo de Confluence
Ujú.
para que quede ahí. O sea, yo tengo todo documentado, pero lo tengo en mi local. Pero la idea es que te quede ahí, vos puedas ir agregándolo cuando necesites.
¿Los tienes en
Y
documentos Word?
no, crea uno una página de Confluence.
Ah, listo, listo. No, pero vos los tenés en un documento Word local.
No, lo tengo en un Obsidian.
Ah, listo. Ah, ok. Estamos fancy. Bien.
Lo tengo en un Obsidian donde tengo ciertas cosas de Okta, tengo cosas de...
Eso está re bueno, Obsidian, porque crea como un second brain, un segundo cerebro, para poder mapear toda la información y esos trocitos de datos, de dónde provienen y eso.
Claro,
Ah, yo sí la había escuchado, pero no la había utilizado.
oh, está
Notion,
bueno.
Notion permitía eso. Eh, yo lo quería implementar, pero me pareció como demasiado. Era como querer montar tu propia AWS. Yo sí, no, o sea, para los casos de uso que yo le voy a dar diario, me pareció como muy overkill.
Oh, yo lo tengo nomás como con documentos así básicos, pero puedes crear un montón de cosas.
Por eso.
O sea, yo lo uso con MDs y lo tengo lo tengo acá en esta máquina, lo tengo con poquitas cosas. Pero en la máquina mía yo tengo como una carpeta para tal cosa, una carpeta para tal otra, ahí voy metiendo los documentos y el Markdown te da muchas opciones, no sé, o sea, yo trabajo más
Sí,
rápido con Markdown que...
sí, sí, total. Absolutamente. Que
Sí,
jode. Sí, porque eso, es muy flexible.
sí,
Um, es re
está bueno.
flexible.
Bueno, oye, ahí nos estamos hablando, nos vemos el lunes. Te escribo por la mañana para que a ver si ya se soluciona eso y
Bien, bien, joya.
te aviso. Genial, bueno, estamos hablando.
Éxito, Eric, que descanses. Nos
Perfecto.
vemos.
Bueno.
Mm, mm, mm. Mm, mm, mm. Mm, mm, mm. Mhm. Ve, esta clase de cositas que son detallitos. ¿Ves eso, amigo? Claro, pero es entrenar en core y cambia tus hábitos. Mm, mm. Cargando peso. Exacto, hacemos entrenamiento de CrossFit, cargando peso de otras personas. Cargando peso de otras personas. You have the luxury because you're receiving, and now you're going to receive this, and now you're going to receive this loans, cheaper loans. This Brian MLS is going to receive cheaper loans from banks. And now the cycle begins. And now the cycle begins. ¿Qué, man? Y sin excusa. No hay excusa, pa. No excuse. No excuse. here you are not going to be. No, you're not gonna pay me. So you're not gonna pay me. Pero exacto, esto es 77, esto está ya M. Esto es un perfect M. It's the ideal M. Eso es porque tengo comida encima, ¿verdad? Eso es porque tengo comida encima. Sí. O sea, yo estaría pensando sin comida como 7,4. Exacto. Un sólido 7,4. Correcto. Esto es cuerpo de un sólido 7,4. Cuerpo de un sólido 7,4. doesn't work that way. Again, all of this now is shifting the attention to be able to deploy those remotely. Right? But again, the nature of the business will not always be like that. The nature of the business will not always be like that. We can see. All right, and we are back. Okay, so let's get into this.
So in this module, we're going to talk about some of what I personally think are the hardest things in React. I'm thinking specifically of stuff like the useEffect hook, as well as memoization. Like, these are complicated ideas that really require a sophisticated understanding of how React works.
I'm gonna make a quick pause here because this is not a required sophisticated understanding. It's just plain understanding. If you have the desire to understand what this thing is doing and how it works, you only go for that, right? And if that desire does not exist, there is nothing wrong about it, right? So I hit the pause button here because that is a common theme in all of these educational contents that I know that they are targeting to a specific audience, which is the masses, right? So you want to now appeal to a more broader audience, okay? You want to try to, well, make them feel great and better about this. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong about it or good about it. It's just for those who truly wants to solve their own problems, because that's what we are all, that's what everybody are doing, okay, is trying to solve their own problems. And to do so, right, we find ways to make that happen. We're trying to find solutions. So nature in itself, I'm assuming that in his very elegant and mysterious way, it hide now the solution of a problem deeply into the problem in itself, not in the solutions. So again, I'm just mentioning all of this is because anytime that you have some complicated stuff, and especially if those stuff are made by humans, they are not complicated. They are just things, human things that you can learn if you have the desire to. That's all.
And one of the most misunderstood things about how React works is this idea of immutability and what it actually means for state to be immutable. And so before we get on to all that really hard stuff, I want to revisit some of the stuff we've talked about around immutability, and I want to go a little bit deeper. So to help me with this, I've created this visualization of the computer's memory, right? This is one of those RAM sticks that you put in your computer. And I want to show what exactly happens as I create and then update pieces of React state. And so the circumstance here is that I have a single component with a single state variable called user. It's an object that has a name property set to Ivy. And let's suppose I want to update the user's name to Ava. Well, if this was plain JavaScript, I could do it by mutating the object by setting user.name equal to the string Ava. But as we've learned, right, this is a no-no in React. We don't want to mutate state ever. And so instead, if we want to change a piece of state, we have to call the setUser function and provide it with a new object that updates whatever properties and values I want. And when I do that, like if I click this little button over here, what we notice is we've actually created a brand new object that lives in a different box in the computer's memory. Now, I should, by the way, say, I'm not a mechanical engineer. I don't really understand how computer memory works, so this is a gross oversimplification. But the mental model is the important thing, and I feel pretty confident that this mental model is both accurate to a degree and helpful. So let's not get too bogged down in the details about bits and magnets, maybe, and focus on the important
Bits and transistors
stuff, which is the React state. I think the thing that's confusing about this is that I'm not editing this particular object in memory. That would be mutation, but I'm also not like swapping it out, right? I'm not changing the object stored in here from this object to this object. I'm creating an entirely separate object that lives somewhere else. It means that both of these objects exist at the same time, at least for a short while. Like in practice, what winds up happening is when I call setUser and I pass it a new object, the component instance will like update which thing it's looking at, and so the original object will be dereferenced, right? There will be no more code that is connected to it, and that signals to the JavaScript engine that, oh, this thing isn't being used anymore, so the garbage collector can come along and sweep it up. I don't want you to think that every time you call setUser, you're filling up your memory with more and more things. Although, if you've heard about memory leaks in React, this is how memory leaks occur. If you have references that continue to reference former values of,
or if you have
references that continue to refer.
Exactly. If you have now variables, aka or identifiers that are continue to referring to those values in memory. So this is also why, for example, closure is so important to understand. And I know this is not part of today's video, but at least it's important to understand is this subtle nuances. Don't get me wrong. No. Understand these subtle nuances of when you want to describe, be precise in this topic, so you can have now an idea or an understanding of the truth of how these things work.
Former values of state. Well, that's a memory leak in React, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit as well. But the core idea here is that I essentially have two different user variables, right? Locally scoped variables that are scoped to this snapshot, to this render, and they each point to different objects, and both of these objects are immutable, right? I'm never editing the object, I'm never reassigning the variable, right? For the end of time, this user variable will point to this object. And so when we say that we're changing the state, it's really more like we're painting a new picture with a new value. And this is true, by the way, even if the new value is structurally identical. So let's say that I call setUser again, except now I pass it a new object that is totally the same as the old one, right? Both of them only have a single property name set to the same value of Ava. And even though they look the same, they are not the same, much like how identical twins look the same, but they're still two distinct people, right? When I call setUser, I hand it a new object, right? It's me, the developer, that's actually creating these objects. And so the moment I do that, the moment I create this object, it's going to be stored in memory. And it doesn't matter that there's some other object in memory that has the same shape. All that matters is I've told React, hey, I'm changing the user object. Here's the new object for you to use in the next snapshot. Now let's consider how this works if we have multiple state variables. And so once again, we still have a user named Ivy, but now I have an items state variable which holds an array of numbers. And for the first render, right, we go through the code, we initialize this object and attach it to the user variable, and we do the same thing for the array. So I have these two different entities in memory. And let's suppose I go through the same process of calling setUser with a handful of new objects. Well, as we've seen, right, every time I create one of these objects and hand it to React by calling setUser, I get a new object that lives somewhere else in the computer's memory. But notice what's been happening with our items array. Each of these snapshots points to the exact same array. And to be clear, I'm still generating a brand new items variable in each of these snapshots, right? I have that line const items equals react.useState. Each of these items is a different locally scoped variable, but they all point to the same underlying reference. I only have one array of numbers, and it's being threaded through every single snapshot. This is kind of amazing, and I wanted to bring it up both because I don't want you to think that every snapshot is like a brand new clean slate where everything is copied and unique and distinct. Like, we do thread values through unless they change, unless we're changing them and passing them to React. But I also wanted to point this out because it's fundamental to how a bunch of things in React works. Like, in this module, we're going to talk about effect dependencies and memoization. And to understand these things, you have to understand the difference between dependencies and memoization. And to understand these things, you have to understand the difference between two items that look kind of the same but are referentially different versus the same reference that's being threaded through. And there's a perfect example right here. If we look at these final two snapshots, right? The snapshots look identical. Like, in both cases, neither of these state variables appears to have changed. In snapshot number 3, I have a user whose name is Ava and an items array with a single digit in it, number 1. And in the 4th snapshot, I have exactly the same stuff. But if we look at the references, right, I see that the user object, the user variables, point to different entities in memory. They look the same, but they are distinct things like identical twins, whereas the items array are both references to the same underlying thing. Even though they're different variables, they hold the exact same entity. They both point to the same thing. I know that this all probably seems very abstract and high level, so I've also created a code playground that lets us tinker with these ideas up close and personal. And to give you a quick rundown of the setup, I have a user state variable that is this object, right, just like in our visualization, and I have a button I can click which will generate a new user object and randomly select from one of these short names that could fit in my visualization. And I call setUser with this new user object, but then I also keep track of every value that is created by clicking on the button. I have this state values array. I'm attaching it to the window so that I can access it in the console. I'll show you that in a second. But effectively, it's a typical React app that keeps track of all of the different state values in this array. So let's say I click the button a few times, I see the name changing down over here, and if I open the console and flip so that I am accessing the console for this iframe, right, I have to do that, otherwise it would be running in the main course platform window. In this window, if I try to log window.stateValues, well, check it out. It's an array of 6
interesting. It's an embedded window here. Holy hell. It's an embedded
different objects. And they're still alive, right? They still exist because I've kind of kept them alive by putting them in this array. But I can see that they are distinct things. I'm not modifying a single object across all of these snapshots. I'm creating new objects, so we actually see that right over here, right? Here is where I create the object and store it in memory. And then here is where I tell React to retry everything, right? Generate a new snapshot. But now this new user state variable should be equal to this object rather than the initial object it was set to for the first snapshot. So I hope that this makes a little bit more sense. I do realize, like, this stuff is hard, and I don't expect you to have that concrete, crystal clear understanding just yet. But hopefully these ideas can percolate in the back of your mind as we go through some of the ideas in this module. And if you ever do find yourself struggling to understand some stuff later in this module, I think it might be helpful to rewatch this video and tinker with some of these things yourself, because I think at the core of so many of the things we're going to talk about in this module is this idea of immutability and how data is passed between snapshots.
But to me, the interesting thing was that the state here, all right, when you set the user state or set the item state, right, it creates now a new array in memory. Exactly. It holds that reference, and if you set a state, right, it now has a new reference on that, and both of them holds the same reference. And if I set the user again, so now all of this state holds a reference to that. So the idea here is that they are now holding a reference even though that hasn't changed across render. All right. The same for this. All right. And when you pass now a new reference or a new object, it's going to create a new reference out of this. And then you get now the ref. Const canvas document query selector canvas context canvas to get context 2D. Draw a 200 times 100 pink rectangle. CTX field rectangle 0 0 200 100. And this is what you get.
So it's easy to forget when I write.
Oh, I do think that was okay. Context is the drawing surface, so we can choose to draw 2D and 3D via WebLG. And now we're talking about is holding for the reference here. Not just for DOM nodes, the ref object created by use ref hooks should be thought as a box. We can store whatever we want in this box, DOM nodes, numbers, arrays, object functions, but they are not going to be affected by rendering. Anything else in a ref. So you are calling is draw, that is going to now draw a black, tomato, white, and here, and it's going to draw that here. So it draw all of this. And when you call that again, it's going to draw that again, and draw that again, and draw that again. So I'm going to dedicate my attention to this section, all right, in the next 2 days, right? So yes, absolutely. Berretti. Mm-hmm. So, yes, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.